In the vast cathedral of the cosmos, where light itself grows old traveling between the pillars of creation, there exists a particular kind of silence. It is not the silence of emptiness, for space is never truly empty. It is the silence of waiting, of patience measured not in heartbeats, but in the slow death of stars, the grinding dance of galaxies, the patient accumulation of dust that will one day become worlds. The Volanti Concordat had listened to that silence for 12,000 years. They had mapped the whispers of pulsars, catalogued the dying screams of supernovae, and charted the gravitational songs of black holes spinning in their eternal darkness. They had touched the faces of 1,000 worlds, raised monuments that would outlast the stars that warmed them, and believed, with the quiet certainty of those who had never truly been challenged, that they understood the shape of forever. They were wrong. And now, in the dying hours of their civilization, as the silence filled with the screams of burning worlds, one of their kind drifted through the void aboard a vessel that had once been beautiful, sending out a message that was less a call for help than a prayer to an indifferent universe. Anyone. Please. Anyone at all. Senior Fleet Coordinator Catherine Valsoris had not slept in 11 cycles. The emergency stimulants coursing through his system kept his 3 hearts beating in their proper rhythm, kept his compound eyes focused on the holographic displays that painted his command chamber in shades of amber and crimson, the colors of warning, the colors of death. But they could not keep the weight from his shoulders, could not silence the voice in his mind that whispered, over and over, that everything he had ever known was ending. He stood at the center of the Amaranthine's Grace, a diplomatic cruiser that had been designed for ceremony and negotiation, not war. Her elegant lines and crystalline viewports spoke of a civilization that had forgotten what it meant to be prey. Her weapons were ceremonial. Her shields were adequate for debris, not plasma fire. She had been built in an era when the Volanthi believed they had no enemies left worth fearing. That era had ended 37 days ago, when the Vorith Dominion had announced their return with the simultaneous destruction of 17 Volanthi colony worlds. Catherine's long fingers trembled against the command console as he reviewed the latest intelligence reports. The numbers had stopped making sense to him 3 days ago. When you count your dead in billions, the individual digits lose their meaning. They become abstractions, statistics, data points on a graph that traced the death of a species. 43 worlds gone. The Volanthi home fleet, the pride of 12 millennia, shattered in the Korath Nebula. The grand archive of Velphosian, containing the collected knowledge of 1,000 generations, reduced to expanding plasma in the void. And his own fleet, the survivors, the refugees, the last desperate hope of his people, scattered across 3 sectors, running out of fuel, running out of options, running out of time. Coordinator, a voice said softly. Catherine turned to find his communications officer, young Selah Valmoris, standing in the doorway of his chamber. Her normally lustrous scales had gone dull with stress, and her eyes carried the hollow look of someone who had seen too much death too quickly. She was barely past her 3rd century, a child by Volanthi standards, and she had already witnessed the fall of an empire. "What is it, Selah?" "We've received responses to the distress call." For a moment, hope flickered in Catherine's chest, a dangerous, fragile thing that he had learned to suffocate before it could bloom into disappointment. The Kelfani? The Jorvasi Trade Union? Selah's expression provided the answer before her words. The Kelfani have retreated behind their dimensional barriers. They've sealed their borders and will not respond to further communications. The Jorvasi—" She paused, and something in her eyes hardened. "The Jorvasi are negotiating with the Vorith. They have offered our refugee convoys locations in exchange for territorial concessions." Kethrin closed his eyes. The Jorvasi had been allies for 8,000 years. They had exchanged scholars, art, philosophy. They had celebrated together at the Festival of Convergence, shared meals and songs, and the sacred traditions of a dozen species. And now they were selling his people's lives for a few more years of existence. "Anyone else?" Selah hesitated. "There is one other response coordinator, but I'm not certain you'll want to." "Show me." She transferred the communication to his display, and Kethrin felt his ridged brow furrow in confusion. The signal was crude, almost laughably so by Valanthy standards. The encryption was simplistic, the bandwidth inefficient, the compression protocols at least 3 generations obsolete. It looked like something his ancestors might have used in the earliest days of interstellar exploration. "What species is this?" "They call themselves humans, Coordinator, from a small system on the edge of the Orion Spur. They've only been spacefaring for approximately 300 years. 300 years? Catherine almost laughed. 300 years was nothing. 300 years was a single Volanti lifetime. 300 years ago, his own grandmother had been alive, complaining about the quality of educational programs for younglings. What could a species accomplish in 300 years? Why are they responding to our distress call? Are they scavengers? Opportunists? Unknown, Coordinator. Their message simply states that they received our transmission and wish to offer assistance. She paused. They're asking for our coordinates. Assistance? Kethrin shook his head slowly. What assistance could primitives possibly offer? We face the Vorith Dominion, a civilization that has crushed empires, that has weapons capable of cracking worlds like eggs. What do these humans have? Stone tools? Chemical rockets? Their technology appears to be fusion-based, Selah said. Their ships are slower than ours, less elegant. But Coordinator... She hesitated again, and Kethrin noticed something strange in her expression, something he couldn't quite identify. What is it? They're already on their way. They didn't wait for our coordinates. They triangulated our position from the distress signal itself and dispatched a vessel immediately. It will arrive in approximately 8 hours. Kethrin stared at her. That shouldn't have been possible. The distress call had been encrypted, its origin point deliberately obscured to prevent the Vorith from tracking them. The encryption was Volanti military grade, designed to be unbreakable by any known species. And yet these primitives had cracked it in less than a day. How many ships are they sending? 1. Coordinator. A single vessel. Classification unknown. 1 ship. Kethrin allowed himself a bitter laugh. 1 primitive ship against the Vorith Dominion. These humans must be either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps, Selah said quietly, or perhaps they are something else entirely. The human vessel arrived exactly on schedule. Kethrin stood on the observation deck of the Amaranthene's Grace, watching through the crystalline viewport as the small craft emerged from its primitive faster-than-light transit. It was an ugly thing by Valanthy standards, all harsh angles and exposed plating, with none of the graceful curves and organic forms that marked civilized design. It looked like something that had been built in a hurry, assembled from whatever materials were available, function triumphant over form. And yet, as he watched it maneuver toward his vessel, Kethrin noticed something that made his scales prickle with unease. It moved with a precision that belied its crude appearance. Every thrust, every attitude adjustment, every subtle correction was executed with mechanical exactness. There was no wasted motion, no inefficiency, no hesitation. It was as if the ugly little ship knew exactly what it was doing, exactly where it needed to be at every moment. "They're requesting permission to dock," Sailor reported from her station. Catherine hesitated. Every instinct told him to refuse, to dismiss these primitives and focus on more important matters. But what more important matters were there? His fleet was scattered, his people were dying, and the Vorath were coming, always, inexorably coming. "Grant them access to Docking Bay 3. "Coordinator, are you certain? We don't know anything about these creatures. They could be—" "What, Sailor? Dangerous?" Catherine's laugh was hollow. "The Vorath have already killed more of our people than these humans have individuals in their entire species. What more harm could they possibly do?" 20 minutes later, Catherine stood in the docking bay, flanked by 2 ceremonial guards whose weapons had never been fired in anger, watching the human vessel's airlock cycle open with a hiss of equalizing pressure. The creature that emerged was smaller than he had expected. It stood perhaps 2/3 of a Valanthi's height, with a soft, vulnerable-looking body covered in artificial garments. Its face was disturbingly flat, with only 2 eyes set forward in its skull like a predator's, and its skin was a peculiar pinkish-brown color that made it look almost ill. It walked on 2 legs, like the Valanthi, but its movements were different, smoother somehow, more economical. "Coordinator Velansaurus?" The creature's voice was strange. Its pronunciation of Valanthi sounds imprecise but understandable. "I'm Commander Sarah Chen, United Earth Navy. Thank you for receiving us." Catherine inclined his head in the formal gesture of acknowledgement. "Commander Chen, I confess I am uncertain why you have come. Your species is young. The Vorath Dominion is ancient and powerful beyond your comprehension. What assistance could you possibly offer?" The human's expression shifted in a way that Catherine's translation algorithms labeled as a smile, though there was something in its eyes, those strange forward-facing predator's eyes, that didn't match the friendly gesture. "We received your distress call, Coordinator. You were asking for help. We're here to help." "With 1 ship?" "For now." The human, Commander Chen, glanced around the docking bay, and Catherine saw her eyes move with that same precision he had noticed in her ship's movements, cataloging, assessing, measuring. "This is a diplomatic vessel, Coordinator. We wanted to talk before we committed to anything." "Talk about what?" "About what you need, about what you're facing, about whether we can actually help, and if so, how." She met his eyes, and Catherine felt an unexpected chill. "We've done some research on the Vorath Dominion since we received your signal. They're impressive, old, powerful. They've destroyed a lot of civilizations over the millennia." "You've researched them?" Catherine couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. "In 8 hours?" "We work fast." Again, that not quite matching smile. "But before we go any further, Coordinator, I need to ask you something." "Ask." "When you sent out that distress call, when you transmitted it on every frequency, in every direction, begging anyone who could hear it to help, did you mean it?" Catherine stared at her. "I don't understand the question." "Did you mean anyone?" Commander Chan's voice was soft, but there was something beneath the softness that made Catherine's scales prickle again. "Or did you mean anyone except the species you've spent the last century ignoring? Anyone except the primitives on the edge of the galaxy. Anyone except the species that your Concordat refused to establish diplomatic relations with because we were too young, too crude, too unimportant. The words struck Catherine like physical blows. He remembered the debates in the Grand Council a century ago about whether to contact the newly spacefaring humans. He remembered the dismissive laughter, the casual contempt, the unanimous decision that a species with barely 3 centuries of technological development had nothing to offer the Valanthe Concordat. He remembered voting with the majority. He paused, searching for words, finding none. We made errors in judgment. We underestimated. You didn't underestimate us, Coordinator. Commander Chen's voice was gentle, but her eyes were not. You didn't think about us at all. We weren't even worth considering. And now, when your ancient enemies have returned and your ancient allies have abandoned you, you send out a call to anyone who might listen. She paused. And we listened. Catherine felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Something that cut through the exhaustion and the grief and the stimulant haze that had become his existence. Shame. Commander Chen, I cannot speak for the decisions of the Grand Council. I cannot undo a century of arrogance. I can only tell you that my people are dying. The Vorath have taken 43 worlds. They have killed billions. They are coming for the rest of us, and we have nowhere left to run. His voice cracked, and he felt his guards shift uncomfortably behind him. Valanthe could not show weakness before outsiders. It was not done. But what did that matter now? I am asking for your help, not because we deserve it, not because we have any right to ask, but because you are here, and we are dying, and there is no one else left. Commander Chen studied him for a long moment. Her face was impossible to read. These humans had such limited expressions, such subtle variations in their features that Catherine's translation algorithms could barely parse them. Then she nodded. Okay, let's talk. They talked for 6 hours. Catherine had expected the human to ask about military deployments, strategic assets, weapons capabilities. He had prepared briefings on the Vorath fleet compositions, their attack patterns, their known weaknesses. He had statistics and projections and probability analyses. Instead, Commander Chen asked about history. She asked about the Valanthe, about their culture, their art, their philosophy. She asked about their relationship with other species, about old alliances and older grudges. She asked about the Vorath, not just their military capabilities, but their motivations, their beliefs, their fears. And she asked about the civilians. How many refugee convoys are there? She sat across from Catherine in his private quarters, a cup of Valanthe tea cooling, untouched before her. How many non-combatants? Approximately 800 million, across 17 convoys. Catherine's voice was hollow. We've lost 3 convoys in the past week. The Vorath don't distinguish between military and civilian targets. To them, extinction is the goal, total, complete. They believe that the galaxy belongs to them, and all other species are merely temporary infestations to be eliminated. Where are the convoys now? Catherine hesitated. This was military intelligence of the highest order. If the humans were working with the Vorath, if this was some elaborate deception. But what did it matter? The Gervasi were already selling that information. The Vorath would find the convoys soon enough. What difference would a few primitives make? He transferred the coordinates to the display between them. Commander Chen studied the holographic map for several minutes, her strange eyes moving from point to point with that unsettling precision. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions, just absorbed. "Your military forces," she said finally. "What's left of them?" "Scattered, disorganized. We had 1,700 capital ships at the beginning of the war. We have 112 now. Most of them are damaged. Many lack full crews. We've been retreating for so long that we've forgotten how to fight." Forgotten? There was something in her voice, not quite disbelief, but something adjacent to it. "The Volanthi Concordat has not fought a true war in 8,000 years, Commander. We had police actions, border disputes, the occasional suppression of piracy. But war, real war, the kind where civilizations die, we believed we had evolved past such things." Catherine's laugh was bitter. "We were arrogant. We thought our technology, our age, our wisdom made us invincible. We were wrong."
"What about your allies? You mentioned the Kelthani, the Jorvasi." "The Kelthani have sealed their dimensional barriers. They will not emerge for 1,000 years, if ever. The Jorvasi are trading our locations for their own survival. The Morthani Republic collapsed 3 days ago. The Vorath destroyed their capital world with their entire government aboard. The Cressian Collective has surrendered unconditionally. We are alone." Commander Chen nodded slowly. "And the Vorath themselves? How many ships do they have? What's their force composition?" "Approximately 9,000 capital ships, unknown numbers of support vessels." Catherine spread his hands. "They are ancient, Commander, far older than even the Volanthi. They ruled this region of space before my species developed written language. They were driven back once long ago by a coalition of 100 species, but that coalition is dust now. Those species are extinct or scattered or hiding. And the Vorath have had 10,000 years to rebuild, to grow stronger, to perfect their weapons of genocide." He expected the human to react to these numbers, to show fear or despair, or perhaps simply to laugh at the impossibility of the situation. 9,000 ships against 112. The mathematics of extinction. Instead, Commander Chen simply nodded again, as if he had confirmed something she already suspected. "One more question, Coordinator." "Yes?" "If we help you, if we commit to this fight, what happens after? Assuming we win, assuming the Vorath are defeated, what happens to the relationship between your people and mine?" Catherine stared at her. "Commander, we are discussing the survival of my species. If you help us survive, we will owe you a debt that cannot be repaid. The Volanthi Concordat will be your ally in perpetuity. Our resources, our technology, our knowledge, everything we have will be yours." "That's not what I asked." Her voice was soft but firm. "I didn't ask about debts or resources or technology. I asked about the relationship. How will you see us, Coordinator? How will your people see us? Will we still be the primitives on the edge of the galaxy, the crude children who happen to be useful in a crisis, or will we be equals?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Catherine only partially understood. "I cannot speak for all Volanthi," he said slowly. "I cannot promise how my people will think or feel, but I can tell you this, Commander Chen." He met her eyes, those strange predator's eyes that seemed to see so much more than their simple structure should allow. "I will never forget what you are offering. I will never forget that when the ancient and the powerful abandoned us, When our civilization stood on the edge of extinction, it was a species we had dismissed as primitives who answered our call. Whatever happens, that will matter. To me, at least, it will matter."
Commander Chen studied him for another long moment. Then, slowly, she smiled, and this time the smile reached her eyes.
"Good answer." She stood, moving with that economical grace that seemed to characterize everything human. "I need to contact my superior's coordinator. This decision isn't mine to make alone."
"Of course." Catherine stood as well. "How long will you need?"
"I'll have an answer for you within the hour."
She was gone before he could respond, leaving him alone with his cold tea and his fear and the first fragile seeds of something that might have been hope.
The hour passed like a century. Catherine found himself pacing his quarters, his scales itching with anxiety, his mind racing through scenarios and possibilities. What if the humans refused? What if this had all been some elaborate intelligence-gathering operation? What if they were, even now, transmitting everything he had told them to the Vorith in exchange for their own survival, just as the Jorvasi had done? But beneath the fear, another emotion was stirring, one he didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't quite suppress. Commander Chen was not what he had expected. She was small, yes, and fragile-looking, and her technology was crude by Valanthi standards. But there was something in the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she asked questions that seemed designed to reach past his defenses and touch something raw and honest inside him. She had made him feel ashamed. She had made him feel hope, and she had done both without raising her voice, without making threats, without displaying any of the arrogance that the Valanthi themselves had so freely shown to lesser species. Who were these humans? What had made them this way? The communication chime pulled him from his thoughts. Coordinator Sailor's voice came through the intercom. "Commander Chen is requesting to meet with you in the main conference chamber. She says she has an answer." Catherine straightened his ceremonial robes, took a deep breath, and walked to meet whatever fate the universe had decreed. The conference chamber was crowded. Catherine stopped in the doorway, momentarily confused. When he had left Commander Chen an hour ago, there had been only her single ship docked to the Amaranthene's grace. Now, looking around the room, he counted at least 30 humans, all wearing the same functional uniforms, all with that same unsettling forward-facing gaze, all watching him with expressions he couldn't read. Coordinator Valsaurus. Commander Chen stood at the head of the chamber's long table, a holographic display floating before her. "Thank you for joining us. We have some people who wanted to meet you before we made our decision." When did these people arrive? "About 10 minutes ago. We have a few ships in the area." Her tone was casual, almost dismissive, and Catherine felt that chill run down his spine again. A few ships? He hadn't detected any additional vessels approaching. His sensors hadn't registered any faster than light transits. How had 30 humans simply appeared aboard his ship without any warning? "Allow me to introduce Admiral Victoria Okonkwo," Commander Chen continued, gesturing to an older human with dark skin and close-cropped gray hair. "She commands the Third Fleet." "Coordinator." The Admiral's voice was deeper than Commander Chen's, and there was something in her bearing, something in the way she held herself, the way her eyes moved across the room, that reminded Catherine of his own military commanders, the ones who had died at Korath. "Sarah has briefed me on your situation. I wanted to hear your perspective directly before we committed our forces." "Committed your forces?" Catherine moved to the table, his scales prickling with a mixture of hope and confusion. "You have forces to commit?"
Your species has only been spacefaring for 3 centuries. The Vorith have 9,000 capital ships.
We're aware of the numbers, Coordinator. Admiral Okonkwo's voice was calm, almost gentle. We've been monitoring the Vorith since your war began. We've analyzed their tactics, their technology, their fleet movements. We know what we're up against.
Then you know this is hopeless. Your single ship.
Who said anything about a single ship?
The Admiral gestured, and the holographic display before her expanded, filling the center of the conference chamber with a tactical map of the sector. Kefren recognized the positions of his refugee convoys, the scattered remnants of his fleet, the creeping red tide that marked Vorith-controlled space.
And then he saw the other markers. Green icons, hundreds of them, scattered across the map in positions that made no strategic sense. They weren't concentrated anywhere. They weren't guarding any particular resource or system. They were simply everywhere, distributed across vast distances, positioned at what appeared to be random intervals throughout the sector.
What are those?
Those, Admiral Okonkwo said quietly, are our forward elements, listening posts, reconnaissance stations, patrol vessels. She met Kethren's eyes. We've been watching, Coordinator, watching and waiting.
Waiting for what?
For someone to ask for help.
The words hit Kethren like a physical force. He stared at the map, at those green icons, those hundreds of green icons, and felt his understanding of the universe shift beneath him like sand.
You knew about the war. You knew the Vorith were destroying us, and you did nothing?
We weren't asked. Commander Chen's voice was soft. Your people made it very clear a century ago that you didn't want anything to do with us, that you didn't need anything from primitives on the edge of the galaxy. So we respected your wishes. We watched, we prepared, and we waited for you to change your minds.
Prepared? Kethren's voice was barely a whisper. Prepared how?
Admiral Okonkwo gestured again, and the tactical display shifted. The green icons remained, but new markers appeared, hundreds more, then thousands, spreading across the map like a tide.
When we first ventured out into the galaxy, she said, we discovered that we were young, very young. The Valanthi had been spacefaring for 12,000 years, the Kelthani for 8,000, the Vorith for longer than anyone could remember. We were children playing in a garden of giants.
We also discovered, Commander Chen added, that those giants had a tendency to step on children, to ignore them, to dismiss them as irrelevant. We studied the history of this region of space, Coordinator. We learned about the species that had risen and fallen, the civilizations that had flourished and been crushed. We learned about the Vorith and the wars they had fought and the billions they had killed.
And we decided, Admiral Okonkwo said, her voice hardening, that we would not be stepped on, that we would not be dismissed, that we would not be crushed.
The display continued to expand. More green icons appeared, spreading across systems that Kethren had assumed were uninhabited, uncharted, irrelevant. Shipyards, mining operations, training facilities, defense platforms, a vast invisible network of preparation and planning that had been growing quietly beneath the notice of every ancient power in the galaxy.
For 300 years, Commander Chen said, we've been building, learning, preparing, not to conquer, that's not who we are, not to impose our will on others, we've seen where that leads, but to be ready, ready for the day when the giants came for us, ready for the day when someone, anyone, asked for our help.
Kethren stared at the map. The numbers were staggering. The scale was impossible. This wasn't a primitive species with a handful of crude vessels. This was an industrial civilization that had, in 3 short centuries, built a military machine that rivaled the combined fleets of every species in the sector.
And they had done it invisibly, quietly, without anyone noticing.
How many ships? His voice cracked. How many do you have? Admiral Okonkwo smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Catherine's blood run cold.
Enough! The next 72 hours passed in a blur of activity.
Catherine watched, increasingly stunned, as human vessels began arriving in waves. Not the crude, ugly ships he had expected from their initial contact, but sleek, efficient, deadly-looking craft that moved with that same mechanical precision he had noticed in Commander Chen's shuttle. They came in formations, dozens at a time, emerging from faster-than-light transit with a coordination that spoke of centuries of practice.
And they kept coming.
Coordinator, Sela's voice trembled as she delivered her latest report. I'm having difficulty counting them. The sensors are registering new contacts faster than I can process them.
How many?
At least 2,000 capital ships in this sector alone, and there are reports of similar deployments in 11 other sectors. She looked up at him, her compound eyes wide with something that might have been fear. They're everywhere, Coordinator. They were always everywhere. We just never saw them. Catherine said nothing. There was nothing to say.
He had spent the last day reviewing the intelligence that the humans had shared with him. Their technology, it turned out, was not as primitive as it appeared. Their ships were crude by Valanthi aesthetic standards, but their weapons, their sensors, their tactical systems, they were different. Not better in any obvious way, not more advanced in any metric he could measure, but different. Designed around principles that the Valanthi had never considered.
Built for war in a way that the Valanthi, in their 12,000 years of comfortable superiority, had forgotten how to match. The humans had never forgotten.
That was the thing that disturbed him most. Talking to Commander Chen, to Admiral Okonkwo, to the dozens of human officers who had come aboard to coordinate with his own meager forces, he had begun to understand something about these people. Something that explained the quiet in their eyes, the restraint in their voices, the patience in their preparations.
They had never had the luxury of forgetting.
Human history, he was learning, was not a story of comfortable superiority. It was a story of struggle, of survival against odds that should have been insurmountable, of conflicts so devastating that entire generations had been shaped by the scars. They had fought each other relentlessly for thousands of years before they even reached the stars. They had developed weapons of mass destruction before they had developed the wisdom to refrain from using them.
They had come within a hair's breadth of annihilating themselves on multiple occasions. And they had survived.
They had survived, and they had learned, and they had carried those lessons with them into the void. Every human ship, every human station, every human outpost was designed by a species that understood on a level that the Valanthi had never quite grasped that the universe was not safe. That peace was not a given, that survival was something that had to be earned every day against an environment that was actively trying to kill you. Coordinator. Commander Chen appeared at his side, her small form somehow reassuring in its steadiness. We're ready to begin the main operation. Admiral Okonkwo has asked if you would like to observe from our command ship.
Your command ship? The UEN Perseverance? It's just arrived at the edge of the system. She smiled, that not quite matching smile. I think you'll find it interesting.
The UEN Perseverance was not what Catherine had expected.
Nothing about the humans, he was beginning to realize, was what he expected. The ship was massive, larger than any Valanthi vessel, larger than anything he had ever seen outside of historical records. It stretched across the void like a small moon, bristling with weapons platforms and sensor arrays and docking bays that were even now disgorging waves of smaller craft. It was ugly by any aesthetic standard. It was brutish. It was designed without any consideration for beauty or elegance or artistic expression. But looking at it, Catherine felt something he hadn't felt since the war began. He felt safe.
"This is our oldest active vessel," Admiral Okonkwo said, standing beside him on the Perseverance's observation deck. She was commissioned during the first unification, when humanity finally came together as a single species. We keep her in service as a reminder.
A reminder of what? Of what we almost became. The Admiral's voice was soft. Of what we chose not to become. Humanity almost destroyed itself, Coordinator, multiple times. We almost became the Vorith, a species defined by conquest, by destruction, by the belief that our survival required the extinction of all others. She turned to face him. We made a different choice. We decided that we would rather be the ones who help than the ones who conquer. But we also decided that we would never be helpless again.
Below them, through the reinforced viewport, Catherine could see the human fleet assembling. Hundreds of vessels falling into formation, moving with that eerie coordination that he was beginning to understand was simply part of who these people were. They trained for this. They prepared for this. They had been preparing for this for 300 years.
The Voreth are moving on convoy Epsilon 7, one of the bridge officers reported. Estimated contact in 14 hours. Current disposition? 12 Vorith capital ships, approximately 200 support vessels. The convoy has 4 escort ships, all damaged. They're requesting immediate assistance. Admiral Okonkwo nodded. Signal the 14th Strike Group. Have them intercept. Just the 14th, Admiral? That's only 18 ships against 12 Vorith capitals. It will be enough. It was enough. Catherine watched the battle, if it could be called a battle, from the Perseverance's tactical display. The human ships moved with a coordination that seemed almost organic, anticipating the Voreth movements, positioning themselves with split-second precision, concentrating their fire on vulnerable points that the Volanthi had never even identified as weaknesses. The Voreth fought like they always fought, with overwhelming force, with crushing firepower, with the absolute confidence of a species that had never been successfully resisted. They were old, they were powerful, they were the destroyers of 100 civilizations. And they were losing. Coordinator, Commander Chen said quietly, watching the display over his shoulder. You look surprised. IK. Catherine couldn't find the words. The Voreth have never been defeated in direct combat, not in recorded history. The coalition that drove them back 10,000 years ago, they won through attrition, through sacrificing entire civilizations to slow the advance. No one has ever beaten them ship to ship. That's what we understand. Then how? We've been studying them. Chen's voice was matter-of-fact. From the moment they emerged from wherever they've been hiding, we've been studying them. Their ships, their tactics, their psychology, their history. She gestured at the display, where another Vorith capital ship was breaking apart under concentrated human fire. They're old, Coordinator, ancient, and that's made them inflexible. They've been using the same basic tactics for millennia because those tactics have always worked. No one has ever given them a reason to adapt. And you're giving them a reason? We're giving them a lot of reasons. She smiled, and this time there was no warmth in it at all. They've never fought an enemy like us, Coordinator. They've fought old empires, civilizations that developed slowly over millennia, species that had time to become comfortable and complacent. They've never fought an enemy that's still climbing, still growing, still learning. They've never fought an enemy that treats every battle as a chance to get better.
On the display, the last Vorith ship in the strike group was dying. Human vessels surrounded it, pounding its shields with coordinated fire, exploiting weaknesses that seemed obvious now that Chen had pointed them out, but that no Valenthi commander had ever identified.
The convoy? Catherine asked.
Secure. Our vessels are escorting them to a rendezvous point now. Chen touched a control, and the display shifted to show a wider view. That was the first engagement, Coordinator, but it won't be the last. The Vorith have 9,000 ships. We've destroyed 12. That's barely a rounding error.
Then what happens now? Now? Admiral Okonkwo appeared beside them, her dark eyes fixed on the tactical display. Now we show them what happens when you threaten the people we've chosen to protect.
Over the next 30 days, Catherine watched his understanding of the universe crumble and rebuild itself.
The humans didn't fight the way the Valanthi fought. They didn't fight the way anyone fought. They moved their fleets in patterns that seemed random until suddenly a Vorith supply line was cut, or a staging area was surrounded, or a key world found itself facing an overwhelming force with no warning at all. They were patient, methodical, relentless. They're not trying to destroy the Vorith fleet in a decisive battle, Selah observed, standing beside Catherine on the Perseverance's observation deck. They're taking it apart piece by piece, isolating units, cutting communications, destroying supply caches. The Vorith aren't designed for this kind of war, Catherine said. He had been learning too, learning to see the conflict through human eyes. They're built for overwhelming force, for crushing their enemies quickly and completely. They've never faced an opponent who could match their speed, who could be everywhere at once, who could turn their own strength against them.
How did the humans learn to fight like this? Catherine was silent for a moment. He had asked Commander Chen the same question 2 weeks ago, and her answer still haunted him. They learned by fighting each other, he said finally, for thousands of years. They developed this kind of warfare against opponents who thought exactly like they did, opponents who were just as clever, just as determined, just as ruthless. The Vorith have never faced anything like that. The Vorith learned to fight by destroying species that couldn't fight back. And the Hulans? The humans learned to fight by destroying themselves over and over until they finally learned how to stop. He watched the tactical display, where another Vorith formation was being encircled, cut off, systematically reduced. The green icons, those ever-present human markers, had spread across the map like a tide. They were everywhere, in every system, at every junction, watching, waiting, striking. And the red tide was receding. On the 43rd day of the human intervention, the Vorith High Command made a decision that surprised everyone. They sued for peace. Catherine stood in the conference chamber of the Perseverance, surrounded by human officers and the few surviving members of the Valanthi High Council, watching as the transmission played. The Vorith representative, a towering, terrifying figure that spoke in a voice like grinding stone, offered terms that would have been unthinkable 6 weeks ago. Immediate cessation of hostilities. Withdrawal from all Valenthi territory. Release of all prisoners and captured population centers. Recognition of Valenthi sovereignty. Reparations paid in resources and technology for the damage caused. It was a complete capitulation, an absolute surrender. Why? Kithron breathed. They still have thousands of ships. They haven't been destroyed, just pushed back. Why would they surrender? Admiral Okonkwo didn't look away from the transmission.
Because they've done the math, Coordinator. They've analyzed our tactics. They've studied our fleet compositions. They've calculated our production capacity, our resource extraction rates, our population growth curves. And they've realized that they can't win. The Admiral's voice was quiet, calm, almost gentle. Not today. Not in 100 years. Not ever. We've been building for this for 3 centuries. We haven't even begun to show them what we can do. But their fleet
is old. Their technology is stagnant. Their tactics are fossilized. They haven't faced a real challenge in 10,000 years. Okonkwo finally turned to face him. We have, every day, every generation. That's what humanity is, Coordinator. We're a species that never stops challenging itself, never stops growing, never stops learning. She smiled, and there was no warmth in it, only a terrible, quiet certainty. The Vorith looked at us and saw children, primitives.
They looked at our 300 years of spacefaring and compared it to their tens of thousands and assumed they understood what we were. What are you?
We're survivors, Coordinator. We're the species that fought its way out of every extinction event our homeworld threw at us, that survived ice ages and plagues and wars that would have broken any sane civilization, that came within a heartbeat of nuclear annihilation and somehow, impossibly, pulled back from the edge. Her eyes were bright with something that Catherine couldn't quite identify. We're the species that looked at the void and saw not emptiness, but possibility.
We're the species that never forgot what it means to struggle, to fight, to endure.
And the Vorith?
The Vorith forgot. Somewhere in their long history, they forgot what it means to face an opponent who won't give up, who can't be intimidated, who keeps coming and keeps learning and keeps adapting until victory or extinction. She turned back to the transmission. They're remembering now.
The treaty was signed 3 days later. Catherine stood on the observation deck of the Amaranthene's Grace, watching the human fleet disperse. Most of the ships were withdrawing, returning to the invisible network of stations and outposts that they had maintained for so long without anyone noticing. A few remained. Protection, Admiral Okonkwo had called it, until the Velanthi could rebuild their own defenses.
Coordinator. Commander Chen appeared beside him, her small form silhouetted against the stars. We'll be leaving within the hour. I wanted to say goodbye.
Commander, Catherine turned to face her. I find myself unsure how to express what I'm feeling. Your people saved us, saved our entire civilization, and we had given you no reason to. We had dismissed you, ignored you, treated you as irrelevant.
Yes. There was no accusation in her voice, just acknowledgement. Why did you help us? Truly. Chen was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but it carried across the empty observation deck like a whisper in a cathedral. Because you asked.
Catherine shook his head. That can't be the only reason. We asked because we had no one else. We asked because we were desperate. There must have been more to your decision than simply answering.
Must there? Chen turned to look at him, those strange forward-facing eyes gleaming in the starlight. Coordinator, do you know why humanity decided to spend 3 centuries building the military you've seen? Why we prepared for a war that might never come against enemies we hadn't yet met?
Because you knew the galaxy was dangerous.
Partly, but that's not the whole truth. She stepped closer to the viewport, her small hand pressing against the transparent surface.
We built all of this because we knew with absolute certainty that someday someone would need help. That someday, out there in the infinite dark, someone would be alone and afraid and facing extinction with nowhere else to turn.
And you wanted to be ready. We wanted to be able to answer. Her voice was barely above a whisper. All those millennia of war, of struggle, of near extinction, we learned a lot of lessons, Coordinator. But the most important one, the one that defines who we are as a species, is this. No one should have to face the darkness alone.
Catherine felt something shift in his chest, something deep and ancient, something that had been calcified by millennia of Volanthy superiority, cracking and falling away.
The distress call, he said slowly. We sent it to anyone. We didn't expect an answer. We certainly didn't expect you.
I know, Chen smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. But we heard it anyway, and we came anyway, because that's what we do, Coordinator. That's who we are. We're the ones who answer.
She extended her hand, a human gesture of friendship, he had learned. Catherine took it.
When your council dismissed us, she said, when they decided we were too primitive, too insignificant to bother with, do you know what we thought?
I can imagine.
No, you can't. Her grip was warm, surprisingly strong for such a small creature. We thought, someday they're going to need us, and when that day comes, we're going to be ready. Not for revenge, not for dominance, but because that's the kind of species we want to be. The ones who help, the ones who answer, the ones who make sure no one ever has to face the darkness alone.
She released his hand and stepped back.
Rebuild, Coordinator. Recover. And when you're ready, when your people have healed and your worlds are thriving again, remember us. Remember what we did and why we did it. And maybe, someday, when some other species sends out a call to anyone who can hear, asking for help they have no right to expect,
We'll answer, Catherine said. The words came easily, naturally, as if they had always been there, waiting to be spoken. We'll answer because that's who we choose to be, because no one should face the darkness alone.
Commander Chen smiled. It was the first truly warm smile he had seen from her, the first one where every part of her expression aligned.
That's all we've ever wanted, Coordinator. Not gratitude, not submission, not even alliance. Just for someone else to understand what it means to be the ones who answer.
She turned and walked toward the docking bay, her small form somehow larger than it had any right to be.
Catherine watched her go. Years later, when the Volanthy had rebuilt their civilization and taken their place in the new galactic order that humanity had quietly, patiently helped to construct, Catherine would often think about that conversation. About the strange, small, impossibly resilient species that had answered a call meant for anyone. He would tell the story to younglings, to diplomats, to the new generation of Volanthy who had never known the terror of the Voreth War. He would describe the primitive ship that had arrived, the quiet officer who had asked questions that cut to the heart, the vast and invisible fleet that had emerged from nowhere to save a civilization that had given them every reason to turn away.
And he would always end with the same words, the words that humanity had taught him, the words that he would carry with him until the stars themselves grew cold. The universe is vast and dark and full of terrors, but it is also full of species who have learned that the only way to survive the darkness is to carry a light for each other.
The distress call was meant for anyone.
Humanity heard it.
And they answered. Not because they owed the Volanthy anything. Not because they expected reward or recognition or payment, but because somewhere, In the depths of their brutal and beautiful history, they had learned a truth that the ancient powers had forgotten.
The measure of a species is not what it takes from the universe, but what it gives.
And in the end, when the stars themselves bear witness, that is the only measure that matters.
The light we carry for others is the only light that never goes out.